Greetings, welcome back. Listen, so in the last video, we left off talking about variables and hypothetical constructs and operational definitions. And so I sort of want to take an example of those things and work a little bit more about quantifying a variable and talk about how this works. Okay, so let's suppose that I'm interested in, well, one of my favorite variables, what I think personally is one of the most important variables in life, and that is happiness. Okay? I mean, we can talk about happiness as a hypothetical construct, right? You know what I mean when I say happiness. People understand what happiness is, but it's not something that can be directly measured, weighed or we can't get the length of it or whatever. But I might be interested in studying happiness, and that is so. Let's break this down a little bit. Let's analyze this. Is happiness a variable or a constant? Well, that's an easy one, right? So, of course, happiness is a variable. It can vary within an individual. So, you might be happier tomorrow than you were today, or you might not be as happy an hour from now as you are right now. So, it can vary within an individual, but we can also see differences in happiness between two people, right? So, it could be that you are happier than I am, or maybe I am happier than another person. And of course, our level of happiness can change as well. So certainly, we would say happiness is a variable, right? Then the next question is happiness, do you think happiness is a continuous variable or a discrete variable? Continuous or discrete? Which one would you say? And I would say it's probably a continuous variable. That would be my assumption. That is, that it doesn't come in packets, that maybe you're just a little tiny bit happier than I am, and I might be way happier than someone else. And in between any of those two measurements are an infinite number of other possible levels of happiness. Okay? And so happiness is a variable. We would call it a hypothetical construct. That is, it doesn't exist in any kind of physical, tangible way. And I might be interested in, for example, what other kinds of variables influence happiness. I mean, I'm sort of convinced that people want to be happy, and wouldn't it be nice if we knew what other variables would influence your level of happiness? Okay? So, what would be some other variables that influence happiness? That is, what makes you happy? What sorts of things? Well, maybe we could say, friends, or maybe we could say family, right? Or maybe we could say good health, or maybe we could say sexual activity, or maybe we could say drugs. I mean, these are candidates, right? These types of things may influence happiness, or we could say the amount of sleep that you get, okay? Or maybe money, right? Does money influence people's happiness? So these are other variables that could have an impact on happiness. In order for me to start to investigate that is if I'm a social scientist, like a psychologist, and I'd say, gee, I wonder if good health is related to happiness, or if family relationships influence happiness. I'm not going to rely on opinion. By the way, opinions are great, but everybody can, people can have differences of opinion, and I might be able to collect some data, some evidence to suggest that the amount of sleep influences happiness, okay? Or that certain drugs influence your level of happiness, okay? Or money influences happiness. In order for me to do some sort of valid kind of research to study whether these things influence happiness, I would need to first be able to measure happiness, right? I mean, let's take money. Let's take money as our example, okay? So we can take all these out, leave those for someone else to study, I suppose. And I could say, gee, I wonder if money is related to happiness. There's a couple of different basic research strategies that I could do here. One of the things I could do would be called a correlational study. Now, we're not going to get to correlation until later in the semester, but I could maybe randomly survey 200 people, and if I could somehow have them report their annual income and then look at their level of happiness, I might be able to find that, there's a relationship between these two variables, that is money and happiness, okay? But again, in order to assess that relationship, I need to have people's level of income, which is pretty easy to define. I mean, if I ask your annual income, and then I need a measure of happiness, okay? Another way I could do this research is to set up kind of an experiment, right? And most of you are probably familiar with the basic structure of an experiment, where I might have one group that gets $0 and one group that gets $500, and then I could compare these two to see if there's a difference, right? To see if we give people $500, if they're going to report higher levels of happiness, okay? That would be an experiment. The other strategy that I talked about where you're asking people their level of happiness and their income. In that case, I haven't taken any control of the variables. I'm just going to see how they're related. In this experiment, I might randomly assign people to one of these two groups. One group gets $0, or maybe we'll give them $10, something like that. This group gets $500, and then measure their happiness. We could see if giving them the money made them happy. Regardless of which strategy I'm going to use, whether it's correlational, seeing if there's a relationship between money and happiness, or experimental, where I'm doing a purposeful sort of controlled difference between the two groups, regardless of which one I'm going to do, I'm going to need a measure of happiness, okay? I'm going to need a measure of happiness. That is, we're going to take this hypothetical construct, and just like I showed you the last time, we're going to make an operational definition that is, what kind of operation am I going to do to define happiness, okay? And we have some options in this case, okay? We have some options. And let's take a moment and think about, well, can we measure happiness? Can happiness be measured? Now, sometimes what happens is students will say, well, you can't measure happiness. You can't measure happiness. I'm like, well, be careful. If you're a psychology major especially, you should say, well, this is a variable that changes between people or within a person, and I need to somehow figure out a way to measure it. I will concede that there is no perfect measure of happiness. There is no perfect measure of happiness. But somewhere between no measure at all and a perfect measure, we're going to have to try to come up with something, okay? So how would we know how happy someone is? How would we know how happy someone is? Well, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. One of the things we could do is just ask the person, okay? So one way that we could do an operational definition to measure happiness is to say, well, and in this case, again, it all gets more complicated, but as long as we start off knowing what we need to do and sort of analyze this and think it through, the better off we're going to be when we do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some data with you that I collected a few years ago from my stats class, and we'll use those data to do some analysis, okay? And what I ask people is to indicate to me your level of happiness, and in this case, psychologists make a distinction between state happiness and trait happiness, okay? Just like state anxiety, trait anxiety, okay? And by that, I mean state happiness means how happy are you at this moment? What state of happiness, right? State anxiety would be how anxious are you right now, okay? Trait anxiety or trait happiness has to do with almost your temperament in a way. That is, in general, are you a happy person? Okay, so that would be happiness as a trait versus happiness as a state. Okay, so I'm going to say, I want you to indicate to me whether or not you are generally happy or not. Okay, so what you would do in that case, you would indicate to me yes or no. Yes, you are generally happy, or no, you are generally not happy. Okay, and you might want to write this down in your notes and just say, if I was responding to this, would I say yes? Would I say no? Now, everybody got it? Now I would say, well, have we measured happiness? And sometimes people say, no, you haven't measured happiness. I'm like, well, wait a minute here. Because if I had a class of 25 students, what I could see is how many people said yes and how many people said no. So let's say a class of 25 students. 20 students said, yes, I'm generally happy. And 5 students said, yes, or no, I'm generally not happy. Okay? One of the things I could do is I could compare that kind of response from a class of 25 stat students to, let's say, a class of 25 intro psych students. And maybe for those students, 10 of them said they were generally happy, 10 of them said they were generally not happy. Well, I guess that would be 20 students. Anyway, you get my drift, right? 13 and 12, let's say. Well, that might tell me something. Those two classes, maybe they look a little bit different, okay? Now, when I say yes and no, I mean, it's a very crude measure, that's for sure. Would I be able to detect changes or differences if I used just yes or no as the responses? Well, that would be a tough one. I mean, I would be able to know if people went from yes to no. I'd be able to know if people went from no to yes. But within the people that said yes, so what did I say? 20 people said yes and 5 people said no. Of those 20 people that said yes, everybody with me? Of the 20 people that said yes, well, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between those 20 people, and I would never assume that they are equally happy. especially because happiness is a continuous variable, right? And so it leaves me kind of lacking. It doesn't allow me to see changes. I mean, we can't really detect any changes yes to yes or no to no, right? If those 20 people that said yes, if I gave half of them $500 and I said, are you generally happy or not? They said yes. Well, it would look like money didn't make any difference, right? So we need to develop something a little bit better than just yes or no, because that doesn't give us a whole lot of resolution. All the yeses look alike. I can tell the difference between yes or no. That's about it. Okay? So I'm still going to ask people if they are generally happy or not. But instead of just a yes or no response, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use what's called a Likert scale. A Likert scale. It's capital L, by the way. Okay? A Likert scale. And I'm going to say, on a scale from 1 to 10, I want you to indicate, in general, how happy are you? Okay? Now, before you respond, and I would like you to think about this, before you respond, I'm a good researcher. I'm going to make sure that I tell the respondents 1 means you're not happy at all, and 10 means you're very happy. Okay? And you can pick any number in between. Whenever you use a Likert scale, though, make sure that you define which is in this case, the happier side, right? 10 is going to mean more happy. I say that because if you did this research with, let's say, 100 people, and you didn't define what was the highest and what was the lowest, I guarantee you, I don't know, 2, 3, maybe up to 5 people are going to think 1 means you're the happiest, okay? So you need to make sure when you use a Likert scale, you need to make sure that you inform the respondent what is the low end. In this case, 1 means not happy, 10 means very happy, and then people can respond, okay? So I want you to think about it for a minute, and maybe in your notes, just write down your number, okay? In general, how happy are you? Okay? Now, what does this do for us if we compare it to the yes-no response? Well, before, if we had a bunch of yeses, right? Bunch of yeses, maybe a no thrown in here once in a while, okay? Bunch of yeses, a no. I can't tell the difference between these yeses. That is, yes, I'm generally happy. When we use a Likert scale, here's what happens. Here's a yes, here's a yes, here's a yes, here's a no, perhaps. Here's a yes, here's a yes, and here's a yes. Okay? But notice here that we can tell the difference between different yeses. We can tell the difference between different yeses. That is, this allows us to have more resolution. Okay? And that's the word, folks. Make sure you write that down in your notes. And this is different than being accurate. When I say, when I say we have more resolution, I don't know if the measure is more accurate, but I know that someone who writes 9 when they would have written yes is different than someone who writes 7 when they would have written yes. I don't know how accurate these numbers are, but I certainly know I have more resolution. It's like a microscope. You turn up the power, you get more resolution. Here's the term, okay? Make sure you write that in your notes. So instead of having all these as just yeses, they're not distinguishable from one another. We can now distinguish some of these responses. And here's a no, okay? All right? This is called a self-report technique Because we are asking the subject themselves to report their level of happiness. Okay? Likert Scale is a method of self-report. Now, Likert Scales don't always go from 1 to 10. Sometimes they go from 1 to 6. Sometimes they go from 1 to 4. Sometimes they go from disagree strongly, disagree, agree strongly, strongly agree. Okay? That's also a Likert scale. 1 to 10, 1 to 5, 1 to 6. Now, there are, things get complicated or more complex. And I always tell students, if you're averse to complexity, you're not in the right place in college, because that's what we talk about, complexity. If these were simple problems, you're already done. You got high school. That was simple. So there's some complexity here. When I use Likert scales in my research, I always like to use a Likert scale with even number responses. 1 to 10, 1 to 4, 1 to 6, okay? Anything like that. Because that doesn't leave a middle option for people to just say, I don't know. I want to force people to either, indicate they're happy or not happy. Now, there's always a question, and I hope you have it too. Well, what if someone is completely neutral? Well, if someone is, first of all, we're going to do research with groups, and we'll talk about that more as the semester progresses. And if I have a group of 4 people that were really neutral, like they're neither happy nor unhappy, I expect some of them to report being a little happy, some of them to report a little bit unhappy. The average would be right in the middle. So we can still get an average that's right in the middle, even when we force people to go to either side. So I always use an even number. Okay. Do you have your 1 to 10 number? Because I'm going to ask you to also use a Likert scale from 1 to 100. Now, on a scale from 1 to 100, where 1 is not happy and 100 is really happy, I want you to indicate your level of happiness on a Likert scale from 1 to 100. Okay? Everybody got that in their notebooks? Now, some people who wrote 8, maybe, for 1 to 10 scale, when you go to a 1 to 100, you're going to be like, well, if it's 1 to 100, then it's 80, right, Dr. Speck? And I'm like, well, if you want to just do straight up math, that's fine. But some people that write 8 will end up writing 78, right? Because 8 was the closest. But they're not quite at 8. If I give them the opportunity on this Likert scale from 1 to 100, they might go to 78. Or they might say 84. Right? Notice what happens here. I mean, let me go back for a minute. They could have all said 80 too. That is 80. They could all say 80. But people do have the opportunity to respond differently, okay, on this 1 to 100. And what does that do for us here? Look at what happens. It's another change in resolution. It's another change in resolution because I couldn't tell the difference between these 3 8s before. If I use a Likert scale of 1 to 100, all of a sudden I see a difference between these 3 people. So once again, that's an indication that we have more resolution. Okay? Also, what we have here is, well, when somebody says 8, maybe they don't really mean 8.000. In this case, they were a little bit below 8, but 8 was the closest. In this case, they were right on. In this case, they were a little bit above 8. Okay? So this is actually evidence, right? This is evidence that happiness is a continuous variable. Otherwise, every 8 would be 80. right? It doesn't just come in chunks. That is, people are taking the liberty to report more. Okay? So 1 to 10, 1 to 100, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 to 20, 1 to 4. Those are all referred to as Likert Scales. It's a form of self-report, and we can increase our resolution this way. I still don't know if this is accurate, because even if someone said 84, and we compared that to someone that says 78 for happiness, excuse me, I still don't know if this person is not as happy as this person, because everybody has their own little ruler of how they're judging their happiness, right? And we've all experienced this. We've come across people like, oh my God, I can't believe you're not happier, or oh my God, I can't believe you're not more depressed. But I don't know what kind of ruler people are using. This person could actually be less happy than this person, just because they're an easy grader, let's say, with happiness. Okay? I don't know the accuracy. By the way, that doesn't mean we just throw out everything. It means that we need to be careful, that we need to be smart, that we need to be good consumers. Okay? It doesn't mean that the system's broke. It just means we have to be careful. Okay? Also, this is why researchers always use groups of individuals. If I have 20 people over here and 20 people here, and I'm asking people to self-report, out of these 20 people, I know there's going to be some people that are really tough graders when it comes to grading their happiness. But I also know that's going to be the case over here. So out of 20 people, there might be 5 people that are really tough. They're not going to say 8 unless they're really happy. But I'm assuming that's going to be the case over here. Everybody with me? There are going to be some people here, they're going to say 9 if they got up in the morning. I mean, they're just like easy graders, right, with happiness. But I'm assuming there's going to be some people over here that are going to do that as well. In general, I think most people are going to be, assessing their happiness on sort of at the same level, okay? But I know that there's going to be outliers. Now, we can talk about that more if you have questions about that. When we work with groups, I'm assuming there's going to be easy graders here. I'm assuming there's going to be easy graders here. I'm assuming there's going to be tough graders here. I'm going to assume there's going to be tough graders here. I'm going to assume for the most part, if people are, going to be assessing their happiness at about the same level here and here in terms of being reasonable, 7s or 8s or whatever it would be. Okay? One way we can measure happiness. Is it a perfect measure of happiness? Absolutely not a perfect measure of happiness. If I did this experiment where I had one group get $0 and one group get $500, and this is a group of, let's say, 20 students, and this is a group of 20 students, and the average happiness here is 7.23, and the average happiness here is 9.85, then I have some indication that money is causing the happiness, okay? So that's how it works with my measure here. With happiness, I feel pretty comfortable asking people about their level of happiness, okay? If I was asking people about their level of racial discrimination, I would probably not use a self-report because people are going to tend to not report if they have racial discrimination, okay? Because it's not something that's socially desirable. So self-report in that case, not quite sure. Listen, if I ask people, how charitable are you? How charitable are you on a scale from 1 to 10? How charitable are you? somebody writes down, oh, I'm 9 on a scale from 1 to 10. I'm a pretty charitable person. And I would say, oh, cool. I say, where's the last place that you gave money to? It's like, oh my God, Dr. Speck, I'm a student. I don't have money. I would give money, but I don't have money to give. I'm like, I understand. So how many hours a week do you volunteer for a, community organization? So, Dr. Speck, I'm really busy with school and I work full time, so I don't have, time to volunteer. I'm like, oh, because on your self-report scale, you said 9 for charitable, and yet I don't see any behaviors, right? So racial discrimination, people don't want to admit when they have that, so it's not good for self-report. On the other side of the spectrum, if something is socially desirable, like charity, being charitable, people might over-report their actual level of charity. Okay, and this is sometimes, if I'm interested in creativity, and I'm like, well, how creative are you? I'm like, oh, I'm really creative. I think outside the box. And I'm like, creative people don't say think outside of the box. That's called a cliche, right? So I'm not sure that I would rely on self-report for creativity either. So in that case, well, if we're not going to do self-report, then how else could we measure a construct like happiness? Okay, we're not just going to ask people. We're not going to do it on scale 1 to 10. So let's think about this for a minute. How would we assess someone's happiness? All right, well, let me ask you this question. How many of you have, at some point in the past, let's say 6 months, how many of you have said something like, wow, Jason really seems happy today? Or, it's like, Jennifer really seems happy today. I'm assuming that everyone listening to this video has said something like that in the past 6 months. And I'm also very confident in that nobody gave their friend a Likert scale to measure their happiness, right? That you were making that assessment based on something other than a Likert scale. So what were you using to make that assessment? When you said, hey, Jennifer seems really happy today, or Jason seems really happy today, what were you doing? Well, you were probably looking at some behavior that would indicate somebody's happiness. And what behaviors were you looking at? Now, some people respond to me and they'll say, well, body language. And I'm like, I don't know what you mean by body language. Like, I sort of know what you mean. That's a hypothetical construct in itself. But what do you mean? Like, I don't know, some kind of semaphore thing? Or you're talking about tattoo? No, they're body language. I'm like, for example, what? People say, well, facial expressions. And I'm like, okay, what kind of facial expressions? This is what we get into when I teach research methods. It's like, what precisely are you talking about, right? Not just body language, facial expressions. What did you see to make you think that Jennifer or Jason was happy? Let's think about it, right? Let's analyze it. Well, I would expect that the number one answer, if we were doing Family Feud here, number one, ding, right, is probably smiles, right? They were probably smiling, beaming, right? And okay, so that is sort of like body language, right? And it's sort of it's a facial expression, of course. But remember, when we do our operational definition, we want to have a quantity, right? We want to quantify that variable. That is the essence of operational definition. This is the concept or the hypothetical construct. Here's where we quantify it. With Likert scales, it's easy to see that, right? Even with yes or no, it's not really a quantity, but we have categories, okay? What about behaviors? Well, smiles. So let's do this. Number of smiles per 3 hours, or something like that, okay? Now, we have to be careful, and sometimes people get frustrated because I'm always like, we have to be careful, we have to be careful. Yes, this is complex, folks. This is complex stuff. That's why I'm starting from the ground level, because when things get more complex, you'll understand why we're talking about that. Number of smiles in a 3-hour period. Okay, cool. I would expect that somebody who has more smiles in a 3-hour period, we're going to say is happier. One of the things that you have to be careful about, though, is someone who smiles like this. I got that going for 3 hours, baby. So that would be one smile in 3 hours, right? That's pretty happy. Another person who might go like this. They might rack up 12 smiles in 3 hours. And so we would have 1 compared to 12. It would look like that person with 12 was happier. The person with 1 continuous smile might actually be the happier person. So this is called frequency, a frequency measure, right? How many smiles per 3 hours, okay? And again, for this class, we're going to learn what to do with the numbers. This is just a sort of a prelude to what we're going to do, but these are where the numbers are coming from. I also might want to do duration of smiling. So if I'm doing this for 3 hours, I have 180 minutes of smiling. If across 3 hours I did this 3 times, but only for 5 seconds each, then I would only have 15 seconds. Okay? So that's something that we need to be careful about. When you look at the research literature, this is why you sometimes see differences when scientists look at how variables are related. And what makes me very sad, but also upset, is when people just look at the headlines and they say, oh, these scientists can't agree. Well, one of them was looking at frequency and the other one was looking at duration. That's not that complex, actually. And this person may get a different finding than this person, okay? And by the way, if I was doing this research, I would measure both. Why wouldn't you? Again, this is sort of more research method stuff, but it's worth noting, okay? Now, we'll simplify it a little bit. Number of smiles in a 3-hour period, okay? And we could then do our $0 or $500 and measure the number of smiles. Now, sometimes what happens is people say, and I love it. I love the questions. Always questions, right? People raise their hand and say, Dr. Speck, I know somebody who never smiles. Even when they're really happy, they never smile. Ah, that is a problem, okay? That is a potential problem. Because if we're using this as an indicator of happiness, the person who never smiles, even when they're happy, is sort of going to be a problem with our data, right? There's another problem as well, and that is, what about somebody who's a giggle puss, right? And they're smiling even when they're not happy. I see a friend of mine, and she's smiling, and I'm like, oh, you seem happy. And she's like, oh, yeah, I'm happy. I just failed an exam, and I went out to my car and I got a flat tire. Like, right? You see this smile, and I'm like, oh, well, that's weird, because you usually smile when you're happy, and you don't smile when you're not happy. Everybody with me? This is kind of like the person that's a tough grader for happiness and an easy grader for happiness, right? When they do their Likert scale. This is always a problem for researchers. It's always a problem for researchers. It's called individual differences. Okay? In a way, this entire course, as it starts to unfold, when we start to do statistics, the computations, you'll see that we're dealing with lots of individual differences. Okay? I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview. Again, this problem of somebody that smiles when they're not happy, or someone who smiles when they, who doesn't smile when they're happy, or smiles when they're unhappy. This is individual differences. We have to pay attention to this, okay? But this is why we do things with groups. Once again, I have a group over here of 20 people and a group over here with 20 people, okay? Everybody got me? Of these 20 people, I absolutely expect that there's going to be one or two people in this group that doesn't smile, no matter what, even when they're happy. Okay? Seems to be a problem here. But if I'm doing this experiment, there's going to be a group over here, right? In these 20 people, there's going to be one or two that never smile when they're happy. One or two that never smile when they're happy here, one or two that never smile when they're happy here. Also, there might be one or two people here that are giggle pusses. They're going to smile no matter what. There's going to be one or two people here that are giggle pusses. Okay? In this group of 20, I expect 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. They're going to smile more when they're happy. They're going to smile less when they're not happy. Over here, same thing. 12 or 13 or 15 people smile more when they're happy, smile less when they're not happy. So that when I look at the average for the two groups, I can still make the comparison. That is such an important point. It's such a key point. Because people get caught up with this. They say, how can we do anything? I know someone who doesn't smile even when they're really happy. I'm like, that is an issue. Absolutely. But we're going to do averages for groups, and hopefully we'll be able to compare the averages. I mean, I'll tell you, there's lots of individual differences with the way people behave. And I like to think I have a good sense of humor, but I'm not really a laughy laugh kind of guy, like, ha, 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 ha. If you come and talk to me and you tell me a joke, if I say, wow, that's a cool joke, that was a funny joke, then you should believe me. I think it's funny. But sometimes you'll be thinking to yourself, wow, Speck is weird. He said it was funny, but he didn't laugh at all. Because I'm not a laugher at jokes kind of a guy. It's weird. Other people are. Individual differences. Now I'll tell you an interesting thing. My brother Bill, oh my God, he's such a bad joke teller. If you're watching, Bill, sorry. He knows. Sometimes he'll come in, he'll say, oh, Steve, I got a joke for you. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, here we go. And he's telling me a joke. So a priest and a duck and a cow walk into a bar. No, it wasn't a cow. No, it was a clown. Walks into a bar. Do you guys know people like this? They tell jokes. You're like, oh my God. There's no joke cadence, right? So he tells me a joke, and then like a third of the time, he forgets the punchline. Like, forgets it. I'm like, oh my God. It's like, no wonder we drink so much beer. Anyway, individual differences. It's there. We'll deal with it as scientists. So, We have self-report. We have behavioral measures. Now for happiness, smiles seems like a nice operational definition. For other things, for someone who's charitable, we might look at number of hours volunteered instead of having people do a Likert scale. Okay, we could have amount of money that people contribute to charitable organizations on their IRS tax forms or something like that. That would be an indicator of a behavior. Okay, self-report, behavioral measures. Okay, and another sort of general category of measurement, and we could do this for happiness. We could do some kind of physiological measure. So, for example, I might look at levels of serotonin. You might look at levels of serotonin in your blood. Let's do nanograms per milliliter or something like that. I don't know how it would be measured. People with higher levels of serotonin, we would say, are happier. People with lower levels, not so happy. We would have our quantity, right? We could look at differences. That's the entire key behind this, is we're looking for differences or change. What mathematical function are we going to use? Subtraction. So what do we need here? We need a quantity. Okay. We need a quantity. So we'd look at differences or change. Serotonin levels. And sometimes people be like, well, that seems kind of sterile. It's too much lab stuff for happiness. Is that really a measure of happiness? Well, listen, if you're a psych major, you should know, even if you're not a psych major, you should probably know this. Prozac is one of the main treatments for depression. When people take Prozac, they get through their depression, and Prozac affects serotonin levels in the blood. Okay, so we have self-report or behavioral measures or physiological measures. There's lots of choices. Some people use all three, and that we're going to get quantities. That's the key. We don't have an inherent quantity here. It's a hypothetical construct. So we then do operational definitions to get our numbers. Once we have our numbers, then we can start doing statistics. Okay? And so I'm going to share some happiness data with you via email. And for the next video, we'll talk about what kinds of descriptive statistics we can do with our happiness data. Okay, so we're going to have Likert scale 1 to 10, Likert scale 1 to 100. And we'll look at those happiness numbers, self-report. It's not behavioral. We could have done that. It's not physiological. I'm not going to take anybody's blood. Okay, we're going to look at a Likert scale, and we'll figure out what to do with those data. We'll start getting into our statistical analyses. Until then, take care, and we'll see you soon.